The chandeliers of La Lumière cast a golden glow over the dining room, each crystal shimmering like captured starlight. The air hummed with quiet affluence. The clinking of wine glasses, the murmur of well-bred laughter, and the soft melody of a live string quartet near the window. At the center of it all sat Tom Grayson, the man who built empires out of algorithms and ambition. His suit was impeccable, his watch worth more than most cars in the room, and yet, behind the measured calm in his eyes, there was a trace of exhaustion. Across from him, Vanessa Moore, his girlfriend of 6 months, laughed lightly as she scrolled through her phone. "Tom, the photographer says the charity gala wants us together on the red carpet next week. Should I tell them yes?" He nodded absently. "Sure." Vanessa tilted her head. "You don't sound thrilled." "I'm just tired," he murmured, sipping his wine. Long day, but the truth was, fatigue wasn't what tightened his chest. It was something else. Something nameless, hovering just at the edge of awareness. Then, like a ripple in still water, he saw her. At first, Tom thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. A woman moved gracefully between tables, her dark hair pulled back, her uniform simple but neat. She carried a tray of champagne flutes, her steps quiet, posture calm. But when she turned slightly, when the light caught her profile, time stopped. Bella. The name formed soundlessly on his lips. He hadn't seen her in months, not since she'd signed the divorce papers and disappeared from his life like smoke. And now, here she was, serving drinks to strangers, her figure softer, fuller, and unmistakably pregnant. Tom's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Vanessa followed his gaze, frowning. "Do you know her?" Tom didn't answer. His mouth was dry, his thoughts chaos. Every molecule in him screamed no, it can't be her, yet every breath told him it is. Bella's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a tray, pretending not to see him, but Tom caught it. The tiny falter in her composure, the way her eyes avoided his table with deliberate precision. He rose halfway from his seat before Vanessa's voice cut through. "Tom, what's wrong?" He froze, realizing how reckless it would look. The CEO of Grayson Holdings chasing after a waitress in the middle of a high-society dinner. So he sat back down, forcing his body still while his mind spun. Every detail hit him like a blow, the way her uniform barely concealed the gentle swell of her stomach, the faint fatigue beneath her calm expression, the simple silver band still hanging from a chain around her neck. It was the ring he'd given her 3 years ago, and suddenly he couldn't breathe. The waiter arrived with their entrees, breaking the tension for everyone but him. Vanessa started talking about Milan Fashion Week, but her words dissolved into meaningless noise. Tom's gaze drifted again. To Bella, now at the far end of the room, pouring wine for another couple. She looked content, not happy exactly, but peaceful, as though the chaos he remembered from their last days together had burned away, leaving only quiet resolve. Tom's hand clenched around his glass. He wanted to stand, to walk over, to ask the 1,000 questions that stormed inside him. "Why are you here? Why didn't you tell me? Is that—" But his voice stayed trapped behind pride and disbelief. Vanessa leaned forward, teasing. "You're a million miles away tonight." He forced a smile. "Just business," she laughed, brushing her hair back. "Well, tell your business to stop ruining date night." Tom nodded, but his mind was still across the room, following every movement of the woman he once called his wife. The string quartet shifted into a slower melody, a haunting piano piece that filled the restaurant like a heartbeat. And as Bella passed by once more, balancing a tray of desserts, their eyes met. It lasted less than a second, but in that second, every wall Tom had built, the power, the money, the detachment, cracked. There was no anger in her gaze, no blame, only quiet acceptance, as if to say, "We're strangers now, and that's okay," and yet It wasn't okay.
Not for him. When she turned away, he felt something inside him twist, something he thought he'd buried long ago. Vanessa excused herself to take a call, leaving him alone at the table.
He watched Bella disappear through the kitchen doors, the echo of her footsteps swallowed by the music. For the first time in years, Tom felt powerless. He had everything, yet suddenly all he could think about was the woman who had nothing but still carried herself with grace. The woman who once believed in him, even when he didn't deserve it. He didn't know how or when, but one truth settled deep in his chest. This was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning of his reckoning. Outside, snow began to fall. The same kind of snow that had blanketed the city the night Bella walked out of his life. And somewhere between the glow of chandeliers and the silence of his guilt, Tom Grayson realized he had just seen his past, his mistake, and maybe his salvation. The cold Manhattan air cut through Tom's coat as he stepped out of La Lumiere. Snow fell in slow, silent spirals, softening the sounds of traffic, muffling the city's pulse. Yet inside him everything screamed. Vanessa trailed behind, her heels tapping the pavement. "Tom, what's gotten into you tonight?"
"You've been off." He didn't answer.
His eyes were fixed on the street ahead, but his mind was trapped somewhere far behind, in a penthouse bathed in sterile white light. Years ago, the memory came uninvited, raw and cruel. It had been winter then, too. He was standing in front of his office window, staring at the city below, when Bella, had said quietly, "Tom, I think I'm ready for us to start a family." He hadn't even looked at her. His voice had been flat.
"Bella, I told you, their kids aren't part of my plan." "Plans change," she'd whispered.
"People change. Not me." She had stood there for a long moment, holding her breath, hoping he'd take it back, hoping he'd say maybe someday. But all he said, as he typed another email, was, "Children destroy focus, and focus is the only reason we have this life." He hadn't seen the tears fall then. He hadn't wanted to. Now, years later, standing in the snow, those words echoed louder than the city around him. He clenched his jaw, exhaling smoke into the cold. Vanessa sighed.
"Are you even listening to me?"
Tom blinked, dragging himself back to the present. "Yeah, sorry, just tired. You should get some sleep." "You look like you've seen a ghost." Maybe he had. He watched her wave down a black car and disappear inside, her perfume lingering like a question he no longer cared to answer. Then he turned back toward the restaurant. Through the window he could still see Bella, now clearing tables, laughing softly with another waitress. She looked
Okay, not broken, not bitter.
just living. The idea hit him harder than it should have, that she'd built a world without him. He remembered the last night they'd shared a home, the night she'd finally said she was leaving. It had been snowing then, too, heavy flakes blurring the city lights outside their penthouse windows. Bella had stood by the door, suitcase in hand, her coat half-buttoned, her face pale but resolute. "I can't keep living in a house where I'm invisible," she'd said quietly. Tom had looked up from his phone, irritation in his tone.
"Invisible? Bella, this isn't about you being invisible."
"It's about priorities. You know how much is riding on this deal?" She'd cut him off, her voice trembling but strong. "You always have another deal."
"Another meeting? Another reason not to come home? I used to think you were saving the world, Tom. Now I realize you're just running from it." The words had landed, sharp as glass.
He'd tried to laugh it off, but the sound had died in his throat. She'd looked at him one last time and said, "I wanted to be your partner, but you only wanted an accessory." He hadn't chased her. Not that night. Not ever. The door had closed with a quiet click, and the silence that followed had been absolute. For a long time, he'd told himself she'd come back, that she always did after cooling off. But she hadn't. Now, as he stood outside that same city years later, watching her through frosted glass, pregnant and working late, Tom realized something he'd never admitted before. He hadn't lost her because she stopped loving him. He lost her because he never made her feel loved. A cab pulled up, breaking his trance. He hesitated, glancing one last time at the restaurant window. But she was gone. He climbed into the back seat.
Upper West Side, he murmured. The driver nodded. Cold night to be out, huh?
Tom stared out the window. Yeah, cold. The cab rolled through the snow-dusted streets, and for the first time in a long while, Tom didn't reach for his phone. He just sat there, watching the city blur past, lost in the weight of what-ifs. What if he'd listened? What if he'd cared enough to stay? What if right now the child she carried was his? The thought hit like a blade, twisting in his chest. He closed his eyes, but all he could see was the image of her standing in the restaurant, calm and distant, her hand brushing against her stomach as if to protect what little she had left in the world. By the time the cab stopped in front of his penthouse, the snow had thickened into a quiet storm. He looked up at the tall glass building that had once felt like triumph. Now, it just looked empty. Tom stood there a moment longer before whispering, "She's not a ghost."
I am. And with that, he stepped inside, knowing that sleep would not come easily. Not when the past he'd buried had finally found him again.
The penthouse on the Upper East Side was a cathedral of glass and silence. Everything gleamed. The marble floors, the chrome fixtures, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. It looked like perfection, but it didn't feel alive. Bella moved through the space like a ghost. The soft click of her heels echoed faintly against the walls as she set the dinner table for two. A bottle of red wine waited unopened. The pasta on the stove had been ready for nearly an hour. She glanced at the clock again, 9:47 p.m. He wasn't coming home on time, again. Tom Grayson had built an empire out of numbers, deadlines, and impossible expectations. To the world, he was brilliance personified, a self-made billionaire before 40, the kind of man who conquered markets and smiled only for magazine covers. But at home, he was a shadow passing through rooms without ever stopping to feel them. When the elevator chimed, Bella's heart jumped before she could stop it. She wiped her hands on a towel and turned, just as the door opened. Tom stepped in, his charcoal suit crisp, his expression neutral. "You're still up," he said, more an observation than a greeting. She forced a smile. "Dinner's ready. It's been ready." He loosened his tie, glancing at his phone. "I told you not to wait up." "I wasn't waiting," she lied.
I just thought maybe tonight. He looked up then, cutting her off with a sigh.
"Bella, I had a board meeting. It ran late. You know how this quarter's been," she swallowed, nodding.
I know,
"I miss talking to you." Tom moved past her, pouring himself a glass of whiskey, instead of touching the wine she'd opened. "We're talking now, aren't we?" The way he said it, dismissive, tired, made her chest tighten. She sat down, clasping her hands together, trying to steady herself. "I wanted to ask you something," she began softly.
I've been thinking about.
"Starting a family." The glass paused halfway to his lips. "A family?" "Yes," she said. "We've been married 3 years."
I thought maybe it's time to think about. No? The word came fast, sharp. Bella blinked. No? Tom set the glass down, jaw tight. I can't do that right now.
"We're expanding into Singapore. I'm barely home as it is."
A child would complicate everything. She stared at him, disbelief washing over her. Tom, I'm not asking you to quit your job. He cut her off again. You don't get it.
"A kid would ruin the balance we've built. You think I can close billion-dollar deals on no sleep?" Her voice trembled. "We don't have a balance, Tom. We have a schedule. You work and I
exist around it," he sighed, rubbing his temples. This again? Bella, you knew what you were marrying.
You knew who I am." She looked at him for a long time, her throat tightening. "I thought I did." He glanced at her then, finally noticing the quiet tears collecting in her eyes. But he said nothing. Instead, he walked toward his office. "I'll be in the study." "Don't wait up." The sound of the door closing behind him was soft but final. Bella sat there, staring at the untouched plates. The steam had long faded. The candlelight flickered weakly in the glass of wine meant to be shared. She whispered to the empty room, "You don't even see me anymore, do you?" That night, she washed the dishes in silence. In the reflection of the kitchen window, she caught sight of herself. Still young, still beautiful, but with eyes that had learned to expect nothing. Over the next few weeks, the distance between them turned into a wall. He'd leave before sunrise and return after midnight. When he was home, he was on calls, emails, or in meetings that somehow followed him even to bed. Bella tried to reach for him in small ways.
A hand on his shoulder, a kiss on the cheek.
A message that said, "Miss you." Sometimes he'd reply hours later with a single thumbs-up emoji. Sometimes not at all. One evening she came home from her volunteering shift at the community clinic and found him asleep on the couch, laptop open, a half-finished report glowing on the screen. His tie was loosened, his face pale under the blue light. She stood there, watching him. The man she'd once believed was invincible. He looked exhausted, older than his 35 years. For a fleeting second she wanted to wake him, to hold him and say, "We can still fix this." But then she noticed the email on his laptop screen. A project proposal titled "Legacy, the Next Expansion." Legacy. The word cut deep, because to him, legacy meant his company. To her, legacy meant a family. She turned away. Later that night, she found the courage to speak again. "Tom," she said softly as he sat reading beside her in bed.
"Do you ever think about what comes after all this?"
After the meetings, the deals, the awards, he didn't look up. "Retirement?"
"No, life," he frowned slightly. "This is life." Her heart sank. That was the moment she knew their love wasn't dying from hatred or betrayal.
It was dying from neglect. She lay awake long after he fell asleep, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, unaware that a new life had already begun there. The one thing he said would destroy his balance, but might one day be the only thing to save them both. The test lay on the bathroom counter, 2 pink lines glowing faintly under the dim light. Bella stared at it, her reflection blurring as tears welled in her eyes. Her hand trembled as she covered her mouth, not from fear, but from something far deeper, something that felt like heartbreak and hope colliding in the same breath. Pregnant, for a long time, she simply stood there, listening to the city's distant hum outside the penthouse windows. Somewhere below, New York carried on. The sound of taxis, laughter, and rain on asphalt. Inside, her world had gone utterly still. When Tom came home late that night, she didn't say a word. He tossed his keys on the counter, loosened his tie, and mumbled a tired, "You're still awake?" She smiled faintly, tucking the test behind her back like a secret she wasn't ready to share. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." He didn't notice. He rarely did. Over the next few days, she carried the secret quietly, guarding it like fragile glass. She still cooked for him, still smiled when he brushed past her in a rush, still pretended everything was fine. But every time she placed a hand on her stomach, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just about love anymore. It was about life. A tiny heartbeat she hadn't heard yet, but somehow already felt. When she finally gathered the courage to tell him, she rehearsed the words in her head 12 times. "He'll understand.
He'll see what this means.
Maybe this could fix us." But when the moment came, it slipped through her fingers. That evening, Tom was on another call, pacing the living room with his Bluetooth earpiece flashing blue. She waited until he hung up, then said softly, "Tom, there's something important I need to tell you." He glanced at her watchlessly, still scrolling through his phone.
Can it wait? I have to be up early? Her throat tightened. It's about us.
"About our future," he sighed.
Bella, please. Not tonight. She stood there, words frozen on her tongue.
For a moment she imagined blurting it out anyway. "I'm pregnant, Tom. We're going to have a baby." But looking at him, distracted, detached, already miles away in his head, she knew what his reaction would be. Silence, disbelief, maybe even anger. So she swallowed her truth. That night, she packed a small suitcase, just the essentials, a few clothes, a framed photograph of their wedding, and the medical appointment card she'd tucked into her wallet earlier that day. At the top of her nightstand, she placed an envelope, the signed divorce papers she'd quietly prepared weeks ago, after realizing that whatever they'd once shared was beyond repair. When she signed her name, her hands didn't shake. She didn't hate him. She simply understood him now. Tom Grayson didn't destroy their marriage out of cruelty. He destroyed it out of blindness, the inability to see what truly mattered until it was gone. As midnight neared, snow began to fall outside the window, soft and soundless. The city lights blurred into 1,000 tiny halos as Bella stood at the door one last time. She turned back to the home they had built. Sleek, beautiful, lifeless. Her eyes landed on the glass wall of his office, still glowing faintly from the computer monitor inside. The screen displayed another spreadsheet, another late-night plan for the next acquisition.
Another step away from her. Goodbye, Tom, she whispered,
her voice almost tender. She left her wedding ring on the counter beside his watch, the two circles of commitment, side by side, both worn out in their own way. Then she opened the door. The winter air bit at her cheeks as she stepped into the hallway. The city below was wrapped in white, the streets muffled by snow. For a second she hesitated, clutching the small suitcase handle tighter. The elevator dinged. By the time the doors closed, she exhaled the breath she'd been holding for years. Down in the lobby, the doorman looked startled to see her at that hour. "Mrs. Grayson?" She shook her head softly.
It's just Bella now. Outside, a yellow cab waited under the falling snow.
She told the driver an address she'd memorized earlier that day. A small rental apartment in Queens. Cheap but quiet, the kind of place where no one knew her name. As the cab pulled away, Bella looked out the window at the skyline fading behind her. The city glittered like diamonds, cold and distant, much like the life she'd just left. She placed a hand on her stomach again, whispering, "It's just you and me now, little one. We're going to be fine." A tear slid down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from sorrow, it was relief. Back in the penthouse, Tom returned home the next morning to silence. He noticed the untouched wine glass, the faint smell of her perfume still lingering in the air. When he found the envelope on the table, his chest tightened. Inside were the divorce papers and the ring. No note, no explanation, just absence. He sank into a chair, staring at the empty room that used to feel like success. For the first time in years, Tom Grayson couldn't focus on anything. Not the emails, not the phone calls, not even the sound of the city below, because in that silence, he realized something he had never admitted to himself before. He had everything a man could want, and somehow he had nothing at all. The apartment in Queens was nothing like the penthouse she had left. The walls were thin, the radiator hissed when it worked, and the sound of traffic hummed constantly outside the window. But to Bella, it was peace, imperfect, honest, and hers. The first morning she woke up there, the sunlight spilled through the cracked blinds and painted the room in gold. She sat on the edge of her mattress, still wrapped in plastic, and pressed a hand to her stomach. The faintest swell had begun to form. "Good morning, little one," she whispered. "It's not much, but it's home." The first few weeks were hard. The rent took nearly everything she had saved. She found work at a small cafe 2 blocks away, the kind of place where people ordered their coffee by name, and the owner, Mrs. Doyle, still believed in cash tips. Bella worked quietly, keeping to herself. She wore a simple apron and kept her hair tied back, her diamond wedding ring replaced by a thin silver band she'd bought for $10 at a thrift store. It wasn't about pretending anymore. It was about surviving. But something strange happened as the days passed. People noticed her kindness, the way she remembered a customer's order or helped carry groceries for the elderly woman who lived upstairs. The world she lived in now was smaller, yes, but it was real. One evening after closing, Mrs. Doyle patted her arm. "You've got a good heart, Bella, the kind this city doesn't see much of." Bella smiled, tired but sincere. "I just try to do what I can." When she wasn't working, she took long walks through the neighborhood, past the fruit stands, the children playing stickball, the laundry fluttering between buildings like city flags. Sometimes she'd stop at the park bench near the river where the skyline shimmered far away. The towers of Manhattan looked smaller from here, almost fragile. Somewhere in that glittering maze was Tom, still attending galas, still closing deals, still living in a world of glass and silence. She wondered if he ever thought of her. Then she'd shake the thought away. He was a chapter she'd closed, the kind that hurt to read but had to end. As her belly grew, so did her resolve. She began journaling every night, writing letters to the child she carried,
even though he couldn't yet hear her. "Dear little one, today was a good day.
I made enough tips to buy apples and milk. Mrs. Doyle says you'll have my eyes, but I hope you get your father's stubbornness. It'll help you survive in this world. I don't know what kind of man your father will be when you're old enough to ask, but I'll tell you this. He loved his work, but he forgot to love himself. Maybe you'll remind him what that means one day." Each entry ended the same way. "We'll be okay, I promise." There were nights when fear crept in. The uncertainty of raising a child alone, the medical bills, the ache of missing what used to be. But every morning, when she felt the faint flutter of life inside her, she knew she had made the right choice. The city outside her window wasn't kind, but it was honest. It made her stronger, sharper, braver. One cold evening in early December, the cafe was busier than usual. A group of businessmen in suits came in, their laughter loud and careless. Bella froze when one of them mentioned the name Grayson Holdings. Her pulse quickened. She turned away, pretending to wipe the counter. "Did you hear Grayson's merger went through?" One of them said. "Guy's unstoppable. New penthouse in Tribeca, new model girlfriend. Same old story." Bella's throat tightened, but she forced herself to keep working. The coffee steamed, the orders kept coming. The world didn't pause for heartbreak. When they left, Mrs. Doyle noticed her pale face. "You all right, honey?" Bella nodded weakly, just a little tired. That night, she sat by the window of her tiny apartment, the city lights blinking below. She whispered softly to the child she hadn't met yet. "You're all I need now. You and me, that's enough." The next day, she went back to work as usual. She learned to hide her growing belly under loose sweaters. Some customers noticed, most didn't. Life went on, quietly, steadily. Around her 6th month, she began visiting a small clinic in Queens for prenatal care. The nurse there, a gentle woman named Irene,
often told her, "You're doing amazing. Bella, you've got strength written all over you." Bella smiled each time, though she didn't always feel it. On her way home one evening, she stopped at a shop window displaying a row of tiny baby shoes, white with soft blue ribbons. She pressed her hand to the glass, eyes misting. One day, she told herself, "One day, I'll be ready for all of it, but for now..." She was proud of what she had built,
a life held together not by luxury or success, but by quiet resilience. And as the first snow of winter began to fall again, Bella stood at her window and watched it coat the fire escapes and cars below. A year ago, she'd walked away from everything she knew, carrying nothing but hope. Now, she smiled faintly as she whispered to the small life growing inside her. "We're almost there, my love. Just a little longer." Tom Grayson had always prided himself on control. Control was his armor, his language, his way of surviving the chaos of the world. But ever since that night at La Lumiere, when he'd seen Bella carrying another man's child, or so he'd thought, control had become an illusion. Days passed in fragments. Meetings blurred together. Contracts and investors meant nothing. His assistant's voice became just noise in the background of his thoughts, drowned out by one image, Bella's eyes, filled with quiet strength and something else, something that looked like freedom. He'd told himself it was just curiosity, that seeing her again had only triggered nostalgia. But as the weeks went on, that lie began to unravel. One night, unable to sleep, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and opened his safe, the one where he kept old documents, legal papers, remnants of a life he never revisited. His fingers brushed over the manila envelope marked B. Grayson, Divorce Settlement. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he opened it. Inside were a few pages, signatures, legal jargon, the kind of paperwork that had ended their marriage as efficiently as any business deal. But one line caught his eye. The respondent declines alimony and any financial compensation. He read it again and again. Declines alimony. Declines compensation. Nothing. She'd walked away with nothing. He sank into the leather chair, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. "Why?" he whispered into the empty room. In his world, everyone took something when they left. Money, reputation, a piece of power.
That was the rule.
But Bella, she had broken it without saying a word. The whiskey burned down his throat, but it couldn't drown the guilt that rose up instead. He remembered the last night they'd spoken before the silence began. Her voice, quiet but firm.
"I don't want your money, Tom. I just want to feel like I matter to you." He had laughed then, a bitter, defensive sound, because he hadn't understood.
Now, sitting alone in a penthouse that echoed with emptiness, he finally did. Money couldn't buy meaning. The next morning, Tom arrived at work later than usual. His assistant, Mark, noticed the dark circles under his eyes but didn't dare ask. Instead of attending his scheduled board meeting, Tom searched for something else, an address, a clue, anything that could tell him where Bella had gone. By noon, he had called the private investigator he occasionally used for business vetting. "Find Bella Grayson," he said simply. The man's voice on the other end hesitated.
"You mean Bella Bennett, sir?"
The sound of her maiden name made Tom's chest tighten. "Yes," he said quietly. "Find her." 2 days later, a report landed on his desk. Thin, clinical, factual. Subject: Bella Bennett. Location: Queens, New York. Occupation: waitress at Doyle's Cafe. Residence: 34th Avenue. Apartment 3B. Tom read every line as though it were a confession. Queens, a waitress. Apartment 3B. He couldn't remember the last time he'd stepped foot in Queens. The streets there might as well have been another world compared to the marble and glass of his life uptown. That evening, as the city lights began to shimmer, he found himself driving toward the East River. His reflection in the car window looked foreign. Expensive suit, hollow eyes. When he reached the cafe, he didn't go inside. He stood across the street, watching through the frosted glass. And there she was. Bella moved between tables, her belly softly rounded, her hair tied back in a loose braid. She smiled as she poured coffee for an old man,
nodded gently to a mother holding a toddler. She looked content. It wasn't the word he would have chosen once.
But now it hit him with the force of something sacred. When her shift ended, she stepped outside, pulling her coat tight around her. For a moment, she paused under the flickering streetlight, breathing in the cold air. Tom wanted to call out to her, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. He waited until she disappeared down the street before returning to his car. That night, he couldn't sleep again. Every image of her, the way she moved, the way she smiled at strangers, haunted him. She wasn't the fragile woman he'd left behind. She was stronger now, and somehow that strength made him ache even more. The next day, he returned. This time, he walked in. The bell above the door chimed softly. Bella turned and froze. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Then her voice came, calm but distant. "What are you doing here, Tom?" He swallowed.
"I needed to see you." "You already did," she said, her tone quiet but sharp.
"Now you can go." He stepped closer, ignoring the eyes of curious customers.
"I just wanted to talk." "About what?"
She cut in.
"About how you decided work mattered more than me."
"Or how you didn't want a family?" Her voice cracked slightly on that last word, and he felt it like a blade. "I made mistakes," he said softly. "I see that now." She gave a small, bitter smile. "And good for you. Some lessons come too late." He wanted to explain, to tell her he'd read the divorce papers, that he knew she'd left with nothing, that he finally understood what she'd tried to say. But the look in her eyes told him she wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. So he did the only thing he could. He nodded, "I'll leave." When he stepped outside, the cold air bit into his skin. Behind him, through the cafe window, Bella turned away, her hand resting protectively over her belly. Tom stood there for a long time, the city roaring around him, realizing that for the first time in his life, there was someone he couldn't buy back, and as snow began to fall, he whispered to himself, "I won't let this be the end." The snow had turned to slush, and the streets of Queens carried the grey fatigue of winter. Yet Tom kept coming back, every day, every other evening, as if the small cafe at the corner of 34th Avenue had become the only place on earth where time still mattered. He told himself it wasn't obsession, just unfinished business. Closure, maybe, but deep down he knew. It was longing. The first few times Bella refused to even look at him. She'd walk past his table, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if he were part of the furniture. The few words they exchanged were short, clipped, professional. "Coffee?" "Black, no sugar." "That'll be $4.50. Her tone carried no warmth, no trace of the woman who used to whisper goodnight against his chest, 'cause the cafe's manager, tall, easygoing, with a habit of reading people faster than they wanted, started to notice. On Tom's third visit, Lucas approached with a polite but firm smile. "Mr. Grayson, right?" Tom looked up halfway through his coffee. "Yes. Look, I know who you are."
"Everyone does." Lucas's voice remained calm but edged with steel.
"But whatever's going on between you and Bella, maybe give her some space. She doesn't need more stress right now." Tom stiffened. He wasn't used to being told what to do, especially by someone in an apron. But something about Lucas's tone, his protectiveness, made Tom back down instead of lash out. He nodded slowly. "You're right." Then almost to himself, "I just don't know how to stay away." Lucas gave him a long, unreadable look before walking off. That night, Tom sat in his car outside the cafe for almost an hour, watching the lights dim one by one. Through the foggy glass, he caught a glimpse of Bella laughing softly at something Lucas said. The sight should have warmed him. Her laughter had always been rare, precious. But instead it twisted something deep inside him. The next day, he came again, and the day after that. Sometimes he'd just order coffee and sit quietly, reading emails he didn't understand anymore. Sometimes he'd leave a generous tip, hoping it might at least make her day easier. But Bella never once softened, until one evening. It was late, almost closing time, and the cafe was empty except for them. Bella was wiping tables, and Tom, as usual, sat at the corner booth, staring at the untouched cup before him. He finally spoke, voice quiet, hesitant. "I used to think silence meant peace, that it meant things were fine." Bella paused mid-wipe, but didn't look at him. He continued, "But ever since you left, silence just means something's missing." She let out a slow breath, then said softly, "You used to love silence more than me." That made him smile, a sad, knowing smile. "You're right. I did." He looked down at his hands. "Now I'd give anything just to hear you talk to me again." For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she placed the cleaning cloth on the counter and turned to him. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion. "Tom, whatever you're looking for, it isn't here. The person I used to be, she's gone." He met her gaze.
"Maybe, but I'm still here."
"Trying to be the man she needed." Bella shook her head, almost pitying. "You don't get to decide that now." He wanted to reach out, to say her name, but Lucas appeared from the back, holding his coat. "We're closing, Mr. Grayson." Tom stood slowly. "Right." His voice was low, almost defeated.
"Thank you for the coffee." As he left, Lucas locked the door behind him.
Bella stood still, staring at the empty chair where Tom had been. For just a second she felt something stir. A tiny, dangerous ache of memory. The way he used to hold her hand when no one was watching. The way he'd whisper her name like a secret. But then she pressed a hand against her belly, feeling the faint movement inside. A child. Her reason. No, she couldn't afford to feel that way again. Outside, Tom leaned against his car, looking up at the glowing sign above the cafe. The letters flickered weakly in the wind. Doyle's Cafe, open hearts, warm coffee. He almost laughed at the irony, open hearts. His had never been more closed, until now. He got in, started the engine, and drove off into the cold night. But he knew he'd be back, because for all his money and power, there was one thing he had never learned: how to walk away from the only person who ever made him want to stay. The snow had returned that week, soft flakes falling under the pale light of street lamps. Tom sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home, the skyline of Manhattan glittering beyond the window. On his desk lay a single envelope, the file he shouldn't have asked for. Inside were copies of medical records, appointment notes, fertility clinic receipts, all under one name, Bella Carter. Dated 2 years ago, when they were still married. For a long time, he just stared at the papers, unable to move. He remembered those nights when Bella had come home tired, quieter than usual, when she'd smiled at him and asked if he'd ever thought about having a family, and he, buried in quarterly reports and investors' calls, had laughed softly and said, "Kids? Not in this lifetime." Now, looking at the proof in front of him, the weight of his arrogance hit like a storm. She had tried. She had wanted their love to mean something more, and he had been too blind, too selfish to see it. He picked up his phone, hesitated for a moment, then set it down again.
Words weren't enough. Not anymore.
He needed to see her. That night he drove to Queens. The streets were nearly empty, slick with melting snow. He found Bella locking up the cafe, her scarf pulled tight against the cold. She froze when she saw him leaning by the lamppost. "Tom?" Her voice was wary. "What are you doing here?" He stepped closer, his breath clouding in the icy air. "I needed to talk to you." She glanced at the street, at the few passers-by.
"It's late."
"Whatever it is can wait." "It can't," he said quietly. Then, almost pleading, "Please." There was something in his tone, raw, unfamiliar, that made her stop. She sighed, then nodded toward the alley beside the cafe. 5 minutes. They stood facing each other under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. Tom pulled the folded papers from his coat pocket.
"I found out you went to a fertility clinic."
When we were still together. Bella's expression didn't change, but her hands tightened around her scarf. Why?
He asked, voice breaking.
Why didn't you tell me? Her gaze met his, calm, steady, and heartbreakingly tired. Because you never would have wanted it. He shook his head, pain flickering across his features.
You didn't even give me the chance to... To what, Tom?
She interrupted, her tone cutting through the cold.
To dismiss me again?
To tell me how children would ruin your focus, your image, your precious company. He flinched as if she'd slapped him. She took a step closer, her eyes glistening. Do you know what it felt like? Sitting alone in a doctor's office, filling out forms, hoping maybe, someday you'd change your mind. But you never did, her voice broke, just slightly. So I stopped asking. Tom swallowed hard, the guilt pressing against his chest.
I didn't know. I swear, Bella, I didn't. She laughed bitterly.
Of course you didn't. You never listened. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of falling snow. He looked at her then. Really looked. The woman standing before him wasn't the quiet, patient wife who'd waited for him to come home. She was someone stronger now. Someone who had rebuilt herself from the pieces he'd left behind. I can't change the past, he said softly. But I can change what I do now. Bella shook her head, tears catching the light.
You always say that, after it's too late. He reached out, as if to touch her arm, but she stepped back. Don't, she whispered. Just don't. For a moment, neither spoke.
The world around them seemed frozen, two souls standing in the wreckage of what could have been. Tom's voice was barely audible. When did you find out? She hesitated, then looked up at him, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach.
A month before I left, the breath caught in his throat. So you were already...
Yes, her tone was gentle, almost sorrowful.
And I knew if I told you you'd stay, kiddo, but not because you wanted to.
You'd stay because you thought you had to. He closed his eyes, the truth slicing through him like a blade. When he opened them again, she was already turning away, her figure dissolving into the snow. Bella, he called after her. His voice cracked. Do you ever...
Think about us?
She paused, but didn't look back. Every day, but thinking about something doesn't mean it should come back. Then she walked off into the white night, leaving him standing there, a man who had once owned everything, now realizing he had nothing worth keeping. The snow kept falling, erasing his footprints, covering the ground where she had stood, and for the first time in years Tom let himself cry.
Not out of anger or pride, but out of pure, aching loss.
The blizzard that night was brutal, wind slicing through the city like glass. Tom sat in his apartment, lights dim, untouched whiskey glinting in the crystal glass beside him. The TV flickered silently, the sound long muted. For once he wasn't in his office, not buried under reports or calls.
He was just
there, alone. Every corner of the penthouse echoed with ghosts. The faint scent of Bella's old perfume still lingered somewhere, that mix of vanilla and jasmine he used to find distracting when she'd kiss him goodbye before work.
Now it haunted him. He stared at the city below, a world of blinking lights and moving lives.
He used to believe success was measured by height, how high his office stood, how high his numbers climbed. But now, the only thing he could see clearly was the absence of her. When his phone rang, he almost didn't answer. The number was unknown. Mr. Grayson. A woman's trembling voice came through.
I'm Bella's neighbor.
You don't know me, but she told me to call if anything happened. Tom straightened, heart hammering. What do you mean? If anything happened?
She's in pain. I think it's the baby. She's bleeding and, oh my God, she can't stand. He didn't wait to hear more.
Stay with her.
I'm on my way. He grabbed his coat and bolted from the apartment, leaving everything behind. The empire, the glass, the silence.
Down the elevator, through the lobby, past the confused doorman calling his name. Outside, the wind was merciless,
Snow whipped against his face, but he didn't care.
He ran to the car, engine roaring to life. Tires screeched on icy streets as he sped toward Queens. His hands shook, not from the cold, but from fear. A kind of fear he'd never known. Not business, not loss, but the thought of losing her. Traffic lights blurred in red and gold. The radio mumbled weather alerts, but all he could hear were the words echoing from that night. You never listened. He was listening now, to the sound of his heartbeat, to the panic clawing inside him, to the truth he'd ignored for too long. When he reached the small apartment complex, he barely remembered parking. He just ran up the stairs, through the narrow hallway, until he reached the door that was slightly ajar. Inside, the scene stopped his breath. Bella lay curled on the worn couch, pale and shaking, her hands clutching her stomach. The neighbor, an older woman in a bathrobe, hovered nearby with a phone in hand. "Ambulance is coming," she said quickly, eyes wide when she saw him. "She needs to stay awake." Tom knelt beside Bella, his knees hitting the floor hard.
Hey, Bella, look at me!" Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. "Tom?" Her voice was a fragile whisper. What are you doing here?"
He reached for her hand, cold, trembling.
"You think I'd let you go through this alone?"
She tried to shake her head.
"You shouldn't be here."
"Too bad," he murmured, brushing her hair back. "I'm here." The ambulance siren wailed outside. 2 EMTs rushed in, checking her vitals, asking questions he couldn't process. He stayed beside her, gripping her hand as they lifted her onto the stretcher. When one of them tried to move him aside, Bella's voice came weakly. "He can stay." So he did. Inside the ambulance, the air smelled of antiseptic and fear. Bella's breathing was uneven. Her eyes darted between him and the ceiling lights flashing by through the window. "Tom," she whispered, "if something happens—" "Don't." His voice cracked. "Nothing's going to happen. You're going to be fine. You both will." She smiled faintly, exhaustion clouding her face. "You sound so sure now." He swallowed hard. "For once I am." He didn't let go of her hand. Not when the wheels hit a bump. Not when the monitors beeped faster. Not when she cried out from another wave of pain. At the hospital, everything became a blur. Nurses, stretchers, doctors shouting codes. Tom followed until a nurse stopped him at the doors to the maternity ward. "I'm sorry, sir."
"You can't go in." His voice broke, desperate. That's my, he didn't even know the right word. "Wife? Ex-wife?"
"The mother of his child?" But before he could say more, the nurse touched his arm gently. "She'll be okay. Let us do our job." He sank into a chair in the hallway, hands covering his face. The sterile smell of the hospital filled his lungs.
Minutes bled into hours. He replayed every word, every fight, every silence.
He thought about the woman behind those doors, how strong she'd been, how much she'd endured without him, and, for the first time in years,
Ethan Grayson, the man who never missed a deal, never failed a deadline, felt utterly powerless. When the door finally opened, a doctor approached.
Tom stood instantly, heart in his throat. "She's stable," the doctor said, smiling faintly.
"And so is your son."
It was close, but they're both strong. For a moment, Tom couldn't move. Then he exhaled, a long, trembling breath, and felt something inside him break open. Relief. Gratitude. Love. He leaned against the wall, tears slipping down his cheeks. For the first time, he wasn't running toward success or away from pain.
He was just
there, present. Outside the hospital window, snow kept falling, but it no longer felt cold. The sterile white of the hospital corridor felt blinding under the harsh fluorescent lights. Tom paced outside the delivery room, his hands trembling so badly he could barely hold the paper cup of coffee a nurse had forced on him. It had gone cold hours ago. He wasn't sure how long he'd been waiting. Time had dissolved into nothing but the rhythmic echo of footsteps and the faint, distant cries from other rooms. Somewhere behind those double doors was Bella and their child. When the nurse finally emerged, he nearly tripped over himself.
"Sir?" she said softly. "She's asking for you." For a second he froze.
Then he pushed through the doors, his heart hammering against his ribs. Inside, the world felt smaller, quieter, though machines beeped steadily around them. Bella lay on the hospital bed, sweat glistening on her forehead, her hands clutching the sides of the mattress. Her face was pale but strong, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion and pain. When she saw him, something flickered there. Disbelief, then relief. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, voice hoarse. He walked closer, shaking his head.
"There's nowhere else I could be." She tried to smile, but another contraction hit.
Her breath caught. She cried out softly. Instinctively, Tom grabbed her hand. It felt cold, fragile, but she squeezed back with surprising strength. "I've got you," he whispered, leaning close so she could hear him over the noise. "You're not alone this time." The doctor glanced up from the foot of the bed. "We're close, Bella. Just a few more pushes." Her chest rose and fell rapidly. She turned her face toward Tom, tears glimmering at the corners of her eyes.
"I can't." "Yes, you can," he said firmly.
His thumb brushed her knuckles, his voice trembling but steady. "You've done everything alone. Just let me do this with you." She looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for the man she'd once known, the one who had chosen ambition over love. But in that instant, she saw something different. His face wasn't made of control and pride anymore. It was raw, scared, human. She nodded weakly. The doctor's voice came again, calm and precise. "All right, Bella, one more." Tom didn't breathe. He held her hand, counted softly with her. The room felt suspended in time until the air split open with a sound so fragile, so miraculous, that it silenced everything else. A baby's cry, sharp, beautiful, real. Tom felt his knees go weak. He laughed and choked on it at the same time, tears burning his eyes. He looked down just as the nurse lifted the tiny newborn, red, wrinkled, alive, and for a moment he couldn't move. Bella lay back, gasping for air, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. Tom reached out, brushing damp hair from her forehead.
"You did it," he whispered.
"You did it?" The nurse placed the baby gently into Bella's arms. The tiny bundle squirmed, letting out another thin wail. Bella's lips trembled as she looked down, the world disappearing until there was only that small face in her hands. He's
perfect," she breathed. Tom couldn't speak.
He sat beside her, one hand still clutching hers, the other hovering over their child, afraid to touch, afraid to break something sacred. When Bella finally looked up at him, she said softly, "You can hold him, you know." He blinked. "Me?" Her smile was faint but real. "You're his father, Tom." The words hit him harder than any deal, any speech, any victory he'd ever had. Slowly, almost reverently, he reached for the baby. The nurse helped guide the tiny weight into his arms, and when he finally held his son, the world shifted. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around his. So small, so impossibly strong, Tom's throat closed up.
"Hey there, little one," he whispered. "I'm your dad. I'm sorry it took me this long." The baby let out a soft coo, eyes still closed.
Tom smiled through the tears. For the first time in years, he felt something pure. Not power, not control, but peace. He looked at Bella. She was watching him, eyes heavy but full of quiet wonder. The tension that had always sat between them seemed to dissolve in that moment, replaced by something wordless and real. "Thank you," he said, voice rough, "for not giving up on him, or—"
"On me," she shook her head faintly.
"I didn't do this for you, Tom. I did it because he deserved a chance to be loved." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll make sure he never doubts that, not for a second." The nurse smiled quietly, checking monitors. The chaos outside continued. Footsteps, voices, life moving on. But inside this small, glowing room, time had stopped. Bella's eyelids fluttered. You should name him. Tom looked at her, surprised.
You sure?
She nodded. You're here. You earned it. He gazed down at the baby again, still nestled in his arms, then said softly, John. His name is John. The name hung in the air, warm and solid. Bella smiled through her exhaustion. John Grayson. That's perfect. Tom leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. You and him, you're my everything now.
I don't care about anything else. Her breath trembled.
Don't make promises, Tom. Just
be here. I will, he whispered.
Every day. Outside, dawn was beginning to rise, a faint pink bleeding through the hospital window. Tom looked at it, then back at Bella and John. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about tomorrow's meeting or next quarter's profit. He was thinking about this, the weight of his son, the warmth of Bella's hand, and the sound of that tiny heartbeat against his chest. He finally understood what it meant to be alive. 3 weeks later, the penthouse that once echoed with silence and the low hum of conference calls now pulsed with new life. Soft cries, the gentle rhythm of lullabies, and the sound of Tom Grayson's awkward footsteps pacing the nursery floor. He had swapped his tailored suits for worn T-shirts and rolled-up sleeves, his once perfect hair stuck up in wild tufts. And yet, when Bella looked at him from the couch, holding their baby with both arms as if cradling the world itself, she had never seen him look more human. John whimpered softly, waving his tiny fists. Tom adjusted his hold nervously. I think he hates me, he murmured. Bella smiled faintly, her voice tired but teasing. He's 3 weeks old, Tom. He doesn't hate anyone yet. Tom frowned, rocking gently from side to side, the way Bella had shown him. He cries every time I hold him. That's because you tense up, she said softly. Babies can feel that. He looked down at his son, then exhaled. Long, deep, trying to let go of the tension that had ruled his body for years. For once, it wasn't about control. It was about presence. When John's cries softened into soft breaths, Tom looked up at Bella in wonder. He stopped. She smiled, her eyes glimmering. You see? He doesn't hate you, he just needed you to relax. Tom laughed quietly, almost sheepishly. Guess I've been doing everything wrong my whole life. Bella didn't respond immediately. She just watched him, this man who used to be nothing but edges and ambition, now standing barefoot in a room filled with warmth and baby blankets. After a while, Tom placed John gently into the crib, adjusting the little blanket over his chest. Then he sat beside Bella, rubbing the back of his neck. I had a call from the board today, he said. They want me back in the office next week. Bella's face stiffened, just slightly. And what did you tell them? That I'm not ready, she blinked. You, the man who never took a single day off. Tom shrugged lightly, staring at the sleeping baby. The company will survive without me for a while. I almost didn't survive without this. The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the soft hum of the baby monitor. Finally, Bella said quietly, I never expected you to change. He turned to her. I didn't either. But when I saw you in that restaurant, I realized I'd built everything except a reason to live. Bella looked down at her hands. You can't fix everything, Tom. Some things don't go back to how they were. He nodded. I know, but maybe we can start from where we are. A faint smile curved her lips, but she didn't answer. Later that night, after Bella drifted to sleep on the couch, Tom found himself standing by the crib again. He stared down
at John, whose tiny chest rose and fell in rhythm with the moonlight filtering through the curtains.
For the first time in years, Tom didn't feel the urge to check his phone, his schedule, or the next big deal. Instead, he whispered softly into the dim room, as if making a vow no one else would ever hear. "I don't know how to be a father," he said, voice trembling, "but I'll learn, I promise." He reached out, letting his finger brush lightly against John's hand. The baby's tiny fingers curled around it instinctively, and Tom froze, feeling the smallest, most profound connection he'd ever known. He thought back to the night Bella had walked out on him, the papers she'd signed, the way he'd watched her go without stopping her. He had been too proud then, too certain of his own importance. But now, staring at this fragile little life, he understood what she had been fighting for all along. It wasn't about control. It was about love. Messy, imperfect, unconditional love. The next morning, Bella woke to find Tom asleep on the floor beside the crib, his arm draped protectively across it. John slept soundly inside, one hand resting near his father's. She stood there quietly, not wanting to wake either of them. Something in her chest stirred, something old and painful that had begun to heal. Later, when Tom woke up, embarrassed and groggy, she handed him a cup of coffee. "You know, there's a bed right there," she teased. He smiled, rubbing his eyes. Didn't want to miss anything. She looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "You really are different now." Tom glanced toward John. He changed everything. You both did. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of peace, of quiet understanding. As the day went on, Tom insisted on cooking breakfast, though Bella laughed at his clumsy attempts to flip pancakes. Later, he carried John to the window, showing him the city skyline. "That's where your mum and I used to dream," he whispered, smiling. "But now you're my favorite view." Bella watched them from behind, her heart full and fragile all at once. She still wasn't ready to say she trusted him completely. Not yet. But she knew this version of Tom wasn't the man she'd left. This one stayed, this one listened, this one tried. And sometimes love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it was about the quiet mornings, the sleepless nights, and the ways someone finally learned how to stay. Central Park shimmered under the soft gold of a late afternoon sun. The trees were budding again, their tender leaves trembling in the breeze, and laughter from children echoed faintly over the lawns. Bella sat on a wooden bench near the lake, her hands folded around a paper cup of coffee. She hadn't planned to come here. She just needed air, space to think. The past months had been both healing and confusing, full of new beginnings wrapped in old fears. Then she saw him. Tom stood across the path, holding John against his chest. He wore a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled up, no tie, no armor of the corporate man he used to be. His hair was tousled by the wind, and sunlight caught in his eyes when he smiled at the baby. For a second, Bella couldn't move. The man she saw now wasn't the CEO who'd once broken her heart.
He was just
Tom, human, warm, present. When he finally noticed her, his expression softened. He walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate, careful, as if afraid she might disappear if he moved too fast. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom sat beside her, careful not to wake John, who slept soundly against his shoulder. For a moment neither of them spoke. The sound of a distant saxophone drifted from the park's corner, blending with the chirping of birds. He fell asleep right after the walk, Tom murmured, looking down at his son. Guess I'm better at this than I thought. Bella smiled faintly. You're learning fast. He turned to her, his voice lower now.
I had a good teacher. Her eyes glistened. Tom, he shook his head gently.
You don't have to say anything.
I know I can't undo the past.
But I also know I can choose differently now. She looked at the baby, then back at him.
You've changed. He smiled, not proudly but humbly.
I had to. The moment I held him, everything made sense.
I used to chase success because I thought it would make me feel alive.
But it turns out all I needed was to hold on to what I already had, and didn't know how to keep. Bella's eyes filled with tears. She had waited years to hear something like that, though she never imagined it would come in this quiet, unguarded way. Tom adjusted John in his arms and said softly,
You don't have to come back to me, Bella. I just want you to know I'm staying.
For him, for you, even if it's just as the man who walks beside you from here on. The simplicity of his words hit harder than any grand apology ever could. She wiped her eyes, smiling through her tears. Do you remember what you said the night we signed the papers? She asked. He frowned slightly. I said too many stupid things that night. Which one? You said you didn't want to be a father. That kids would destroy your career. Tom closed his eyes for a second, the memory stinging. Yeah, I remember. She reached out, gently tracing her fingers along the baby's small hand. You were wrong. I know, he whispered. He didn't destroy anything. He built everything back. For a long time they just sat there. No rush, no tension, no fear. The air smelled faintly of spring and promise. Then Tom turned to her and said softly, You know, this park was where I first dreamed of our future. I pictured us walking here, maybe with a kid someday.
I just didn't know how to be that man back then. Bella tilted her head.
And now? He smiled, shifting John slightly before reaching for her hand. Now I want to learn how to stand with you. Her breath hitched.
And if you fall?
He looked straight into her eyes, his voice steady. Then you'll help me up, like you always do. A tear rolled down her cheek. She nodded. Maybe. This time we'll walk together. The sun dipped lower, painting the lake in shades of amber and rose. John stirred, letting out a soft sigh, and Tom instinctively rocked him, his movements gentle, patient. Bella watched them, her heart swelling with a mix of love and quiet awe. This was not the man she'd left months ago. That man had been powerful, untouchable, made of ice. This one, sitting beside her, holding their child, was fragile, imperfect, real, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the warmth of him beneath the fading sun. Tom, she whispered, I think this is what love is supposed to feel like. He smiled, turning his face slightly toward hers.
Not perfect.
Just honest. They sat like that until the sun disappeared behind the skyline. Around them, the park lights flickered on, casting soft halos on the path. Tom rose slowly, holding John close, and offered Bella his free hand. Ready? He asked. She took it without hesitation. As they walked together, father, mother, child, their shadows stretched long beneath the golden glow. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was theirs. And sometimes that was enough.